Okay, this is something that I genuinely did not expect to be writing about for my criminal justice class, and that would be a Star Trek episode from 1966. The episode is called Mudd's Women, and on the surface it looks like a campy sci-fi romance about a charming con man and three beautiful women floating through space. But when you actually sit down and run it through the AMP model, which is the framework that we use to identify human trafficking, what you will find underneath all that space adventure is a pretty textbook trafficking operation. And so that's what this video is about. We're going to break down the episode piece by piece using the AMP model and show exactly where the trafficking elements show up and why the fact that nobody in 1966 called it that, which actually tells us something important. Here's what happens in the episode. The USS Enterprise intercepts Harry Mudd, a space smuggler, traveling on an unauthorized vessel with three women, Eve, Ruth, and Magda. Almost immediately, the women start distracting the male crew members dramatically. The exception is Spock, because he's half Vulcan and operates on pure logic. Now, one of the women, Eve, drops this line early on. She says Mudd buys and sells people, and his criminal history quickly surfaces. The Enterprise ends up stranded near a mining colony because the chase to apprehend Mudd used all of their dilithium crystals, and this is where the transaction starts to take shape. Mudd secretly radios miners nearby and tells them he has beautiful women on board and essentially sets up a deal. The women in exchange for the crystals the ship needs, plus his release. Meanwhile, it comes out that all three women have been taking something called the Venus drug, which is an unlawful substance that maintains their youthful appearance. Eve pushes back on taking it and then eventually gives in under pressure. The miners come aboard, they negotiate, and one of them, Ben Childress, ends up isolating Eve at his home during a sandstorm. He gets angry when her appearance starts to fade without the drug. He makes his own separate deal with the captain, and that's where the episode ends. So on the surface, it's adventure, romance, moral lesson about beauty, but underneath, we see recruitment, coercion, exploitation, and the barter. Before we get into the AMP breakdown, let's establish the legal foundation. The Trafficking Victim Protection Act, or TVPA, was passed in 2000 federally. It was the first comprehensive federal law in the United States specifically designed to address human trafficking. Before that, there was no unified federal protocol for identifying traffickers or protecting victims. In fact, victims were frequently criminalized rather than treated as people who had been harmed. The TVPA defines two forms of what it calls severe trafficking. The first is sex trafficking, when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or involves a minor. The second is labor trafficking, recruitment, transport, or control of a person through force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of exploitation. Now, here's the thing. Mudd's Women aired in 1966. 34 years before the TVPA even existed, which means the writers weren't thinking about trafficking law. They were writing a science fiction episode about a con man, and yet what they wrote maps out perfectly onto a federal trafficking definition that wouldn't exist for decades. That gap between what's happening on screen and the language we'd eventually use to describe it is kind of the whole point of this analysis. So what is the AMP model? AMP stands for Act, Means, and Purpose. It's the framework used to establish whether human trafficking has occurred. All three elements have to be present. The act is what was done, recruiting someone, harboring them, transporting them, receiving them. The means is how it was done, through force, fraud, or coercion. And the purpose is always exploitation, sexual, labor-based, or otherwise. You need all three for a TVPA violation. The exception would be for minors and sex trafficking. You do not need the coercion part. And we're going to walk through all three that we see in this episode. We will start with the act. Mudd transported these women across space without proper documentation and on an unauthorized vessel. That's a foundational action, recruitment and transport across jurisdictions, which is exactly how trafficking operations work in the real world, whether it's across state lines or international borders. Then the women are received by the Enterprise crew, then transferred to the miners. Each handoff is its own stage of the act element. The fact that the mining colony wasn't even Mudd's original destination doesn't matter. The transaction still happened. The women were redirected as a bargaining chip when circumstances changed. That's actually very consistent with how trafficking works. Victims get rerouted, traded, or bartered based on opportunity and the trafficker's immediate needs. And then there's Mudd's profile. He's charming, he's manipulative, he's already wanted by Starfleet. Trafficking research consistently shows that traffickers are rarely first-time offenders. In fact, a 6-year study by the McCain Institute found that 24% of people arrested for sex trafficking of minors had prior criminal history, and the most common prior offense was a violent crime. Mud fits this profile almost exactly. Now we'll talk about the means, and this is where it gets really specific. The venous drug is the fraud. The women's appearance is being artificially maintained by an illegal substance that they've become dependent on. That dependency is not incidental, it's the mechanism of control. Mud needs them to look a certain way to be marketable, and they need the drug to maintain that appearance, so they keep cooperating. That same McCain Institute study that I mentioned found that 15.7% of traffickers use drugs or alcohol as a recruitment and control tool with their victims. What Mud is doing in this episode is not a sci-fi invention, it's a documented tactic. The minors also believe the women's appearance is natural. They don't know about the drug, which means this is also a fraud on the buyers, another dynamic that we see in real trafficking cases where clients or employers don't know the people they're accessing have been exploited to get there. And then there's the coercion. Mud silences Eve when she tries to speak freely to the Starfleet officer. He tells her she's unwanted back home, but desirable where he's taking her, which is a classic psychological manipulation. Isolation from support, making the victim feel like the trafficker is the only one who values them. When Eve finally breaks and says, "I just can't do it, I don't care what Mud says," that's a moment of someone cracking under sustained psychological pressure. And the fact that the other two women appear more compliant, it's not a contradiction. In real trafficking cases, victims often appear cooperative because of conditioning, fear, or because they've simply run out of their perceived options. The consent question is also raised directly in the episode. A Starfleet officer asks whether the women came voluntarily. Even in 1966, the writers understood that consent matters. But consent obtained under coercion or chemical dependency is not meaningful consent under the law. Eve can't speak freely in that moment. That's your answer. Lastly, we have the purpose. This one's almost explicit in the dialogue. Eve says clearly, early on, that Mud buys and sells people. Mud himself describes what he's providing as warmth for the lonely men on the frontier. These aren't coded statements. These are the characters telling you exactly what the transaction is. The miners negotiate directly with the captain, crystals in exchange for access to the women. Human beings are being traded for resources. That's commodification, the defining characteristic of the purpose element. And then Childress becomes a secondary exploiter. Once Eve is at his house, isolated from everyone else, he starts making his own demands. He wants her to be aesthetically pleasing. When her appearance changes without the drug, he feels deceived and gets angry, not because he lost a companion, but because he lost a product that did not perform as advertised. That's the buyer dynamic in trafficking. He then cuts his own deal with the captain outside of Mud entirely. The pipeline has now extended beyond the original trafficker. That happens in real cases too. And the captain. This is the part that's easy to gloss over, but shouldn't be. He knows that Mud is a criminal. He knows these women are being traded, and he accepts the arrangement because the ship needs those crystals. That is institutional complicity, and it's documented in the real world. The Alameda County DA's office prosecuted a Hayward police officer just this year for accepting cash and access to women in exchange for not reporting a brothel. Authority figures who look the other way because it's convenient. That's not fiction. Here's the thing about what Mud is doing. It's not a new idea. The supply of women to isolated male populations is a pipeline with a very long history. In colonial America, single male settlers who couldn't marry anyone started sending for women from England. They were called the Jamestown Brides or the Casket Girls. Men paid a dowry and civil contracts were drawn up. If you were unsatisfied, you could sue. That's not so different from what's happening on this mining colony. The concept evolved through centuries into what we now call international matchmaking, or more bluntly, mail order brides. Research by Minervini and McAndrew in 2006 identified a very specific demand pattern. Men seeking women from developing countries often marketed as exotic or traditional, meaning women from backgrounds of strict gender roles willing to fulfill domestic and sexual functions in exchange for economic stability or an immigration opportunity. That is the same transaction. Mud is supplying the colonial version of it. The fact that this pattern showed up in a 1966 science fiction episode, before the TVPA, before modern anti-trafficking frameworks, before any of us were calling this what it is, says something, that these structures have existed for centuries. The language to name them is what's new. So, how does this actually map onto federal law? Under the Mann Act, interstate or foreign transport of women for purposes of prostitution, debauchery, or other unlawful activity is a federal crime. Section 2421 covers the transport itself. Section 2422 covers coercing or enticing someone to travel for these purposes. Mudd transported these women across jurisdictions. He coerced and manipulated them. The Mann Act was originally passed in 1910, and originally it was to prevent interracial marriage, but now it's been worked into preventing human trafficking across the country. And under the TVPA, Mudd is the recruiter and the seller. That makes him the trafficker. The women were transported through fraud, the Venus drug, and coercion, like psychological manipulation and silencing them, and the purpose was sexual and domestic exploitation. Childress is the buyer. The enterprise captain is an institutional enabler. All three elements of the A&P model are satisfied: the act, transport and transfer; the means, fraud and coercion; and the purpose, exploitation as commodities. Under TVPA, this is a violation. So here's what I leave you with: a 1966 science fiction episode about romance and space adventure that maps cleanly onto a federal trafficking framework that didn't exist for another 34 years. All three A&P elements are present. The TVPA would be violated, and the Mann Act would apply if this were happening here in the United States. But the episode didn't treat it as trafficking. It treated it as entertainment. It treated it as a charming rogue doing women a favor by finding them husbands. And honestly, that's not so different from how we still talk about some of these dynamics today, in music, in movies, and how we frame commercial sex as a lifestyle choice rather than looking at the systems that produce it. The patterns of exploitation are not new, and what changes is the language that we have to name them. And if we can identify trafficking in a Star Trek episode, if we can see the recruitment, the fraud, and the coercion, the commodification, right there in a piece of 1966 pop culture, then we can learn to see it in real life too.